Ladies and gentlemen, the Great War, the First World War as it was later called, broke out at the beginning of August 1914. And it followed on a month of intense events and activities. Indeed, the month of July 1914 has probably been more studied than any other month in history. Thousands of documents have been published, British documents, French documents, German documents, Russian documents, Italian documents. Only the Serbs haven't revealed their documents, so they're said to be in print. Hundreds of historians have labored. One book after another has been written. Ever since the end, indeed, ever since the beginning of the Great War, this has been a compelling theme for historians. During the war, of course, each side blamed the other. The Germans said it was caused by Entente aggression, planned by Russia or planned by France. The Allies said that it was caused by German aggression. The Treaty of Versailles repeated this statement, that it was German aggression that had started the war. And then gradually, as historians worked, these sharp interpretations were rejected, and there grew up, I think, something like a general agreement. There were still qualifications that one power had made more mistakes or was more at fault than the other, but broadly, by the time the Second World War came along, certainly even in the 1950s, historians were agreed that there had been no deliberate plan for war on the part of any power, that there had been a series of mishaps, mistakes, misunderstandings. As Lloyd George said, we all muddled into war. And then when we'd all got settled down, you know, historians with, well, such of them as use notes have got all their notes written down forever. I've always been able to change my mind quicker, of course, because I haven't got any notes. Don't have to change the notes, you see. But others have got to do a whole year's work. Just when historians thought, well, that's one subject I can talk on forever and never have to add anything new, there came along a German historian, Fritz Fischer from Hamburg, studied, first of all, German war aims actually during the war. They were, as you can imagine, to hold on onto all the territory they'd conquered and get more if they could. But then he turned back to the period before the war and identified these aims as having already been formulated, perhaps not in the highest places, but the talk in very influential circles was of the conquests that should be made. Other historians joined him. Many of them argued, or some of them argued, that the Russian army was outstripping the German, and the German generals had agreed that in 1914 was the last chance when they could fight a favorable war. So that an extraordinary thing has happened. In recent years, the younger generation of German historians have come more and more to the belief that the imperial German government was actually a driving force for war, and that the war which broke out in August 1914, far from being a war of accident, was a war of design, as one of them said, long prepared for. The imperial government, it was alleged, was anxious for war in order to prevent the victory of social democracy and the transformation of Germany into a democratic country. It was fought not only in the interests of the imperial powers, the officers, the army, but of the German landed class. And I may say, the historians who said this were not Marxists, they were historians from Western Germany. In fact, the Marxists in Eastern Germany are very jealous that they hadn't hit on this. They said, of course, empires cause wars, but they had not done the work in detail. It was the development of purely liberal German historians. Others laid more emphasis on the military side, the actual fear that Russia was going to get too strong. And though the change has been less in other countries, all the time one hears echoes of the same story. Well, the only way one can answer this, I think, is to describe what happened, or some of it. On June the 28th, everyone I think knows this, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand visited the town of Sarajevo in Bosnia. Bosnia is a Slav, Serbo-Croat province, only acquired by Austria-Hungary in 1908. There was a good deal of discontent there. Franz Ferdinand did not, however, go there in order to make a demonstration against the discontent. He went because he had married beneath the permitted degrees. His wife was only a countess. so she did not rank as an archduchess. But if he went to Sarajevo, which was still under military occupation, he could go as Intendant General, Inspector General of the Army, and she would rank right at the top. It was to give his wife a treat. He went to Sarajevo, he never gave a thought to what the Serb population was thinking. The Serbian government certainly didn't want to provoke a crisis, of that we can be quite sure. There were, as there have been in later times, of course, plenty of national conspirators. Half a dozen of these, they were schoolboys working for what we now call their A-level, happened to be in Belgrade, and they said we oughtn't to let the Archduke's visit go without some sort of demonstration. And although they didn't, in fact, belong to the secret society, the Black Hand, which was supposed to organize conspiracies, they got a couple of revolvers and a couple of bombs, and they turned up on the day. And as the Archduke drove along, the first conspirator couldn't get his revolver out of his pocket because the crowd was too tight, and the next of them thought a policeman was looking at him, and the third of them felt sorry for the Archduke's wife. The fourth of them simply went home. Fifth of them threw his bomb, which missed, though it injured one equerry. The sixth of them, having heard the bomb go off, thought, oh, well, it succeeded, so he stepped over. At that moment, the procession drove by, and he realized it had failed, and he sat down in the cafe, very gloomy. The Archduke drove on to the town hall, arrived in a great rage, said, I come here and you greet me with bombs. I'm not stopping. I'm driving straight out. I'm not going back to through the old town. However, the chauffeur hadn't been told that they were driving straight on, not turning. When they came to the turn, where the original route had been, he turned. And there was the student, schoolboy, sitting on the edge of the pavement in a cafe. Princeps, he was called. And to his astonishment, he saw an open car with the Archduke and the Archduke's wife stationary in front of him. So he walked out of the cafe, stepped onto the running board, cars used to have running boards in those days, took out his revolver, shot the Archduke, and then aimed at the governor of Bosnia, who was sitting in the front of the car, and hit the Archduke's wife, who was sitting in the back. That was the assassination of Sarajevo. You know how tempting it is to say ifs. If the chauffeur had not made his turn, no assassination, no war. Well, you know, if you're an empire, you can't allow the heir to the throne to be assassinated in your own country. Something has to be done. And the obvious thing to do is to blame the nationalists, and particularly to blame Serbia. It really had nothing to do with him. The Austrian government was anxious to do this, but they'd had troubles. They were a shaky old empire. They couldn't succeed. They couldn't go ahead without the support of their German ally. So a German representative went off to see William II. Nearly everyone had gone on holiday. All the generals were on holiday. The general staff wasn't working at all. Moltke was somewhere up in the country having an agreeable time. William II himself was not in Berlin. He was out in Potsdam, just off to the North Sea. However, he had time to see the Austrian, and in the afternoon, the Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, arrived as well. And William, supported by Bethmann, gave a firm response. Germany will support Austria and her grievances against Serbia. Not surprising, after all, if you'd had a close friend, as Franz Ferdinand was of William's, no doubt you would think something ought to be done about him. Germany will support Austria in her claims against Serbia and will stand by Austria even if Russia, the patron of Serbia, intervenes. Now, this is the critical point of the whole new argument. Did William and Bethmann say this because the plan for war was already prepared? I find this difficult to believe when they didn't know there was going to be an occasion for war. Secondly, we know quite well, neither William nor Bethmann consulted a single general of any importance. They didn't turn to the general staff and say, is this time ripe for a war? How long do you want before there is a war? The general staff never knew. More than this, William had never been told the earlier arguments, such as there were. He, indeed, had no acquaintance with the military details. We just got, quite recently, some new information. Somebody has investigated all the reports of the German military intelligence for the whole month, which, curiously, no one had looked at before. And what does this tell us? It tells us that on the 5th of July, which was when the meeting took place, military intelligence was not given any warning that war might be imminent. During the whole month of July, German military intelligence took no particular activities. No general was consulted, no troops were moved, no preparations for war were made. That indeed, if this was a decision for war, it was a very haphazard one. And when the reports of German military intelligence give out, you would imagine you were in a completely peaceful country, as indeed I think you were. There was then a long gap, very characteristically Austrian, having decided to act once against Serbia. It took them 3 weeks to draw up an ultimatum. One reason, they say, is because President Poincaré was visiting St. Petersburg, and they didn't want a fuss while the French president was with the Tsar. But another reason, that they were solemnly working away, trying to discover, and totally failing to discover, any kind of proof that Serbia had been involved. In the end, they really felt they must do something, so they hodgepodged an ultimatum and sent it to Serbia. The Serb government was extremely anxious not to have a war. Serbia had just been involved in the Balkan wars. The Serb army was in no condition for war. Pasic, the prime minister, very characteristically said he was going on holiday and would leave his colleagues to draft an answer. However, at the last minute he was pulled back. And the Serb answer totally accepted every Austrian demand. Then, before it was handed over, the ministers revised it and cut out a number of the concessions. This is another puzzling little point. Why did the Serbs, instead of simply accepting every humiliation, alter the ultimatum, so the answer to the ultimatum, so that it would be unsatisfactory? This we do not know. It's sometimes alleged that the Russians told them to do it because Russia really wanted to provoke a war. No evidence. The Russian minister to Belgrade, Hartwig, had been in such a state of excitement over this tense situation that, calling on the Serb prime minister, he'd fallen down dead. Or was it calling on the Russian representative? At any rate, in the middle of a diplomatic conversation, he fell down dead. So Russia had no representative in Belgrade. This was another curious thing. My own guess is that the Serbs wanted to prolong negotiations. They thought, if we accept everything, then that'll be it. But if we put in some hesitations, then the Austrians will have to come back and make the demands again. Instead of this, the Austrians, I suspect, knowing how dilatory and hesitating they themselves were, acted resolutely for once. The Austrian minister looked at the answer, said, not a complete acceptance, broke off relations. At this, for the first time, there was a chance to negotiate. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, suggested there should be negotiations between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. To prevent negotiations, Austria then declared war on Serbia, fearful that if there were negotiations, concessions would be imposed on Austria as well as on Serbia. Grey's line, by the way, was that all the concessions should be made by Serbia. He said, peace is more important than justice, and therefore Serbia, as the weaker power, must give way. Fortunate, perhaps, that he didn't ever get the negotiations started. The Austrian declaration of war on Serbia was pure theory. Nothing followed from it. Now, this gives, I think, the essential setting to the outbreak of the First World War, a particular accumulation of events which had never happened quite like that before and was not to happen again. All the great powers, of whom there were 5 or 6, now had vast conscript armies. These armies, of course, were not maintained in peacetime. They were brought together by mobilization. This had already existed, as I mentioned to you on a previous occasion, in the Austro-Prussian War, that mobilization caused delays. But by this time, there was a further complication. All mobilization plans depended on the railways. At that time, the motor car, the automobile, was hardly used, certainly not as an instrument of mass communications. And as you are aware, railways demand timetables. You can't just go down to a railway station and say, start moving these chaps, as you can load them into a car or a truck or a coach and say, off with you. All the mobilization plans had been timed to the minute. Months, years before. And what is more, they could not be changed. Moreover, if you tried to modify them in one direction, it would ruin them in every other direction. That any attempt, for instance, by the Austrians to mobilize against Serbia would mean that they couldn't mobilize as well against Russia, because the two lots of trains would be running against each other. The same problem was to arise in regard to Russia, and in the end, even in regard to Germany, that it was impossible, if you had a plan for mobilizing against France, to switch it round and mobilize against Russia. Any delay, any alteration in a mobilization plan meant not a change for 24 hours, but at least 6 months before the next lot of timetables were ready. The Austrians couldn't mobilize against Serbia because this would mean they were defenseless against Russia, so they didn't mobilize. Russia then thought she ought to stake out some claim to prove that she was going to support Serbia. So the Tsar and his advisors contemplated mobilization, but only against Austria. And this was actually ordered. Then the Russian generals who knew about the timetables pointed out that if they began to mobilize against Austria, Russia would then be totally defenseless against Germany, because you couldn't then do the mobilization against Germany as well, or in supplement, because the train times would all be out of joint. So they scrapped the partial mobilization. And then the next day they said, but this is terrible, we have done nothing. Right, we'll have general mobilization. And the actual scene, we know, when they were still hesitating, and the chief of the General Staff himself said that this was rather pushing things beyond what they wanted. They had no idea of a war against Russia. Even against Austria, this was a threat, not by any means a real preparation for, because they knew quite well that partial mobilization plans against Austria wouldn't work, were a mere gesture. And the chief of the General Staff rashly said in the Tsar's presence, "It is very hard to decide." And the Tsar, who was one of the most weak-willed men there had ever been, was touched by this and said, "I will decide. General mobilization." He then, according to his diary, having made this, went out, found it a pleasant, warm evening. It doesn't mention the mobilization in his diary. It just says, pleasant, warm day, went for a bathe in the sea. Such was Russia's contribution. But now, with Russia having decided on mobilization and beginning mobilization, the problem moved to Germany. And here again, this is entirely a matter of railway timetables. It was said afterwards that mobilization meant war. Now, technically, for most countries, this wasn't true. It was a step towards war. Mobilization, after all, took place within your own country. The British fleet, the Royal Navy, had mobilized as late as 1911. Russia mobilized in 1913. There were occasions when other powers had mobilized, and because war didn't take place, the armies could be dispersed. With one country, however, this didn't apply. The German General Staff, ever since the creation of United Germany in 1871 under Bismarck, had contemplated the possibility of war on two fronts. France on the one side, Russia on the other. You must remember, I don't say this either in criticism or in defense of general staffs, you must remember it is the function of general staffs to plan for wars. It doesn't mean necessarily that they want these wars, it doesn't mean necessarily that they'll bring them about, but every general staff, at any rate, I don't know whether they do it now, but until recently, every general staff planned for wars. If you can't find a likely case for a war, then you plan for an unlikely case. But after all, there was a likely case in regard to Germany. Germany did have two great neighbors, France on the one side, Russia on the other. Moreover, in 1894, France and Russia had made an alliance, which was technically defensive in nature. Each would help the other if attacked. Actually, they were planning the other way around, but did face the problem that, for whatever reason, Germany might have a two-front war. The chief of the General Staff, more than one of them, Moltke said it, the elder Moltke said it, Schlieffen said it, the younger Moltke said it, They all laid down, Germany cannot fight two great wars at the same time. As often happens with chiefs of the general staff, they were quite wrong. In 1914, Germany fought a two-front war and fought it successfully till 1918. Germany could have gone on defending herself indefinitely. This was a false alarm, but it was an alarm which absolutely dictated their policy. If you are faced with war on two fronts and you haven't got the resources to conduct both wars, what should you do? By definition, you can't eliminate one of the dangers by diplomacy, because if you did, there wouldn't be a two-front war. In fact, there wouldn't be a war at all. You're assuming diplomacy has failed. The German answer was to get in one blow first, and so decisively that they would have eliminated one enemy. At first they thought of doing it against Russia, then decided this was too difficult. Russia was too big. They go rambling into far remote places. The other, therefore, was to eliminate France. Ever since when they began planning this first, by 1875, ever since then, the idea had been you must beat France first. But France had a strongly fortified frontier. And after about 1890, the Germans decided they couldn't rush this frontier in the way that they'd rushed the French frontier in 1870. A way round must be found. This way must be through Belgium. They'd arrived at this conclusion as early as 1893, although it took a long time before the full plan was developed. Its most detailed form was arrived at in 1905. Characteristically, even now, the plan wasn't, people talk as though this plan devised by Schlieffen, the Schlieffen plan, was something absolutely dictated. Not at all. They were still playing around with it and still doubtful. But an essential part of this plan, one essential part, was to go through Germany. The other essential part, which was equally important, was that there could be no delay between mobilization and war. Because if there were delay, then Russia would catch up and the Germans would get the two-front war after all. So that the moment that the Germans decided on mobilization, they decided for war. Or rather, it wasn't they decided for war, the thing followed of itself. The railway timetables, which in other countries brought chaps to their mobilizing centers, to their barracks and so on, in the Schlieffen plan continued. They did not bring the troops to their barracks. They took them into Germany and northern France. The German mobilization plan actually laid down the first 40 days of the German invasion of France, and none of it could be altered, because if it did, all the timetables would go wrong. Thus the decision which the German General Staff made and which Bettmann endorsed on the 29th of July was a decision for a general European war. And yet none of them remarked on these more profound things, the danger of the Social Democrats. In fact, they thought the German Social Democrats wouldn't be a danger because Russia would be in the war, and it was known that German Social Democrats all hated Russia. There was no consideration of the background. Nothing was weighed except the technical point: if Russia mobilizes, we must go. Germany, in fact, then launched the war. Poor old Serbia was forgotten. The Germans declared war on Russia simply because Russia had mobilized. They were very stuck over France. They had no conceivable grievance against France. They demanded that France should promise neutrality, to which the French Prime Minister merely replied, France will consult our interests. They then invented an allegation that German towns, Nuremberg, had been bombed by French planes. It was totally untrue. Whether there had been ever bombing, I'm not clear. It may be that a German plane had dropped a bomb, but this too didn't matter. The thing was to get the war going. Thus, the war came about, in my opinion, mainly because of railway timetables. There was one further, and in the long run perhaps, a most dramatic and decisive consequence. The continental powers were at war. Great Britain was not. The whole trend of British policy had, or certainly the desire of the British people, had been to stay out of war. The Liberal government was pledged, or rather asserted that Great Britain had no pledges. In secret, the British Army had already arranged a complete, not only mobilization plan, but a railway timetable to take the British army to the left flank of the French army. But this had been concealed from the British public, denied to the British public. Allegations were made constantly by the Prime Minister, by the Foreign Secretary, that no commitment had been made which would limit the freedom of Parliament and the British people to decide. Now, this was very awkward because the French had been told over and over again, yes, yes, we shall stand by you if you're threatened by Germany. And the cabinet was divided. It looked as if the Liberal government would break up. Perhaps the Conservatives would take over. There would be even more controversy than there'd been during the Boer War, more than there'd been during the Revolutionary Wars against France. And then came the news that the Germans had demanded the right to go through Belgium. It's often said that this had been known for a long time beforehand, that the Germans had such military plans was indeed known to the French and to others, though their full extent was not known. That these plans existed on a diplomatic basis, people weren't clear about this. Indeed, Bethmann Hollweg himself, the German Chancellor, had no idea until the 29th of July that he would be setting his name to a demand that the Germans should go through Belgium. British Liberal ministers later on claimed that they just hung back and said, well, don't worry, because they knew Belgium would cause the, would solve the problem. Certainly it came as a complete surprise to most people and produced a tremendous reaction. Great Britain, it seemed, went to war not in order to play a part in the balance of power, not in order to aid France or to destroy Germany as an imperial rival or to destroy the German navy. Great Britain went to war, the phrase was used at the very first, to fulfill her obligations to Belgium and in defense of the rights of small nations. It did the trick in the House of Commons, it did the trick with British public opinion. In a sense, it's done the trick with people ever since. Very few people looked at the Treaty of 1839, which established Belgium as a neutral country. The guarantor countries were given by this treaty the right to intervene in order to defend the neutrality of Belgium. There was no obligation laid on them to do so. I'm not saying for a moment that there was no obligation of a moral kind. Belgium was a small country. Belgium was very wrongfully invaded. Just as, for instance, in 1916, France and Great Britain invaded Greece in exactly the same way, though with less fighting, than the Germans invaded Belgium. But the obligation was something done for the sake of public opinion. All the great powers had relied, in fact, on the deterrent of great armaments. Previously, the deterrent had worked. And on this occasion, the deterrent did not work. And so it will be again.